In this lecture, we'll be looking at arguably the most important 10-year period in all of U.S. history. And as you know from your reading, we're talking about the Reconstruction Era, or that 10 to 12 years following the end of the Civil War. Now, typically, Reconstruction gets the time frame of 1865 to 1877, and there's good reason for that. We'll go into why we say that it effectively ended in 1877. But when I say the most important 10-year period, I'm really looking at the legislation that was passed by Congress and the amendments that were made to the Constitution. And we can start with the 13th Amendment in 1865 that permanently abolished slavery in the United States. That's the first of 3 Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. And then in 1875, we have the last major piece of Reconstruction legislation, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and that prohibited racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. Now, these amendments, these bills, and the legislation that was passed by the federal government in the Reconstruction period laid the basis, laid the foundation for equality in the United States, for equality for all Americans. Reconstruction addressed what the Constitution had initially failed to address, which was the glaring hypocrisy that the principles and values laid out in the Declaration of Independence, in which all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were only really given to one segment of the population, which was white men. Well, here now in Reconstruction, those promises are going to be delivered to all men. And yet, even though we still have women to address when it comes to the equality issue, and even though after Reconstruction, many of the rights and liberties now guaranteed to people in America, regardless of race, would be stripped away from blacks in many parts of the South, those sleeping giants, as Charles Sumner called these Reconstruction amendments, would be the foundation or the motivation and the justification for the Civil Rights Act nearly 100 years later in the 1960s that finally answered some of these promises and unresolved issues. So let's take a look at how it all played out. Here's a snapshot, a quick bullet point view of some of the main subtopics that we'll be covering in this lecture. We're going to work through a number of themes that focus on the creation, the implementation, and the removal of this period of post-Civil War Reconstruction in the United States from 1865 to 1877. The 4 major subtopics of this lecture together tell the chronological and thematic development of many of the events during the Reconstruction period. So we have the meaning of freedom, the making of radical Reconstruction in the South, and the overthrow of Reconstruction. When studying both the textbook and your lecture notes, it's going to be helpful to connect each of these larger topics and their meanings to construct an understanding of Reconstruction as a whole. Additionally, connecting the people, events, dates, and overall anecdotes, historical stories, or examples within each of these subtopics will also give you a better understanding of each individual stage of Reconstruction. Each subtopic will come with a focus question. So really what the focus question is intended to do is to help you kind of keep your notes pointed in a certain direction. So as we talk about the meaning of freedom, your notes should really be constructed in a way where you're able to make connections to this question or to an answer to this question. So the focus question for the first subtopic, the meaning of freedom, is what visions of freedom did the former slaves and slaveholders pursue in the post-war South? Now, this is a really important question because it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the struggles over the meanings and the boundaries of freedom were largely taking place on the ground level, not just in Washington, D.C. Yes, there was a struggle over redefining the meanings and boundaries of freedom taking place in Congress and in the White House and in Washington, D.C. as a whole. But on the ground level, the newest free Americans, the Black Americans, had their visions of what it meant to be free. And we'll talk about those. And the slaveholders, the former slaveholders in the South, had their visions of the meanings and boundaries of freedom. And this was going to be a place of hotly contested ground as these two entities, along with the federal government, attempted to redefine what it meant to be a free American. Now, in the post-war years, the destruction of slavery made the definition of freedom central to reconstructing the nation. Whether freedom simply meant abolition of slavery, or whether it would mean the expansion of African American rights, became a terrain of conflict. James Garfield framed it into a very succinct question and point when in 1865, and he was a congressman from Ohio, later president for a few months since he was assassinated shortly after his inauguration, but he posed a question to his colleagues in 1865 when he asked, "What is freedom? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion." And his point being that it wasn't enough just to take the chains off of people. To make them free meant that they needed to enjoy the rights and liberties of being an American. Now, African Americans' understanding of freedom was shaped by their experiences of slavery. And after the Civil War, African Americans were obviously eager to participate in activities forbidden under the slave system. Black institutions established under slavery, such as the family and the secret slave church communities, and free blacks' churches and schools were strengthened and expanded after the war. The family was fundamental to post-war African American life. Former slaves sought to find loved ones separated from them by sale, and widows of black soldiers won the fight to gain pensions from the federal government, which acknowledged the status of slave marriages. Reconstruction also transformed relationships within families as black men and women sought to inhabit the separate spheres of free families, with women spending more time with families at home and men engaging in most work outside the home. Yet poverty compelled many black women to find wage work. After the war, most blacks also left white churches and established their own churches. Independent black churches, most notably Methodists and Baptists, grew rapidly, and the church became central to black life, providing an educational, social, and political space for the black community. Freed people actively sought to improve themselves through education, which they hoped would allow them to read the Bible, prosper, and participate in politics, and the first black colleges were founded at this time. Now, inevitably, in a society in which political participation was central to freedom, former slaves wanted the right to vote. Once the war ended, and even earlier in some parts of the South, free blacks and former slaves asserted themselves in the public sphere, meeting, petitioning, and demanding the right to vote and organize their own political groups and candidates. Black leaders insisted that anything less than full citizenship would betray the war's meaning. Blacks now celebrated the 4th of July, a holiday that many white Southerners soon came to shun. 4th of July celebrations were one of the ways that blacks displayed their patriotism. They celebrated the values and the principles of the United States that were finally being realized in the post-Civil War era. Another patriotic holiday that we still celebrate today was actually started by black Americans during this time. Every May, they would go out and they would decorate the graves of fallen Union soldiers who had fought for the cause of freedom, who had fought to free these 4 million black Americans who had lived under horrific conditions in slavery. And every May, we still celebrate soldiers, but we call it Memorial Day. In addition to wanting political access, black Americans naturally wanted economic access as well. They wanted economic opportunity. And land ownership was key to that. Land ownership was in fact core to the former slaves' sense of freedom. By acquiring land, the freed slaves hoped to create an economic life and communities beyond white control and interference. Some former slaves believed that they had actually earned rights to the land through their unpaid labor, and there's an argument to be made there. While freed persons' ideas of freedom were similar to that of white Americans, including self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and economic independence, they often saw freedom as an open-ended process of transformation, not a birthright that could be assumed. Although the freed people failed to achieve full freedom as they understood it, their definition did much to shape national debate during the turbulent era of Reconstruction. Most Southern whites were dismayed by defeat and emancipation, which caused enormous destruction and resulted in Northern domination. Some 260,000 Southern white men died during the war, more than a fifth of the South's adult male whites, and the war destroyed much of the agricultural property on which the Southern economy was based. Plantation-owning families faced enormous changes, having lost their slaves and their life savings, which had been invested in Confederate government bonds. With their slave labor gone, some had to engage in physical labor for the first time in their lives. Southern planters tried to impose their own vision of freedom on the former slaves, seeking to regain the old control they had exercised under slavery. Freedom for the planters still meant hierarchy and mastery. From their perspective, it was a privilege, not a right, and did not mean economic independence or civil and political equality. For Southerners, for Southern whites, freedom essentially meant the bare privilege of not being chained, as Garfield had worded it. Northerners immediately tried to impose their own vision of freedom as free labor. Blacks would become wage workers and landowners, just like free whites in the North, and Northern investors would inject capital and migrants into the South to rebuild the economy. The South would eventually resemble the free society of the North. Conflict was inevitable. Planters wanted a labor system as close to slavery as possible. Former slaves wanted economic autonomy and access to land. It fell to the Freedmen's Bureau to attempt to establish a working free labor system. Directed by O.O. Howard, a Civil War veteran from Maine, the Freedmen's Bureau was an experiment in government social policy, and its responsibilities can only be described as daunting. The Bureau's agents were tasked to establish schools, give aid to the poor and aged, solve disputes between whites and blacks, and ensure equal treatment for former slaves and white unionists in the courts. Though the Bureau, which existed from 1865 to 1870, had no more than 1,000 agents at its height, it accomplished much in education and healthcare. By 1869, nearly 3,000 schools, serving more than 150,000 pupils in the South, reported to the Bureau. But the Bureau had a conflicted legacy in economic affairs. The Bureau believed that sound race relations in the South would rest on fair wages and working conditions and on opportunities for improvement and social advance. But freed people wanted land, not wage work on plantations. The law founding the Bureau enabled the agency to divide abandoned and confiscated land into 40-acre plots for rental and sale to the freed people. This was based off of General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which is where the idea of 40 acres and a mule comes from, because he believed that it would be best to take these confiscated lands from these high-ranking Confederate officials and plantation owners and redistribute it to the former slaves in these 40-acre plots, and also discharge any old government mules from the army to these black Americans as well, so that they could use the mules to plow and work the land. But in summer of 1865, President Andrew Johnson ordered that almost all confiscated land in federal hands be returned to former owners. In South Carolina and Georgia, Army troops forcibly evicted blacks who had been given land by General Sherman. Although blacks protested, no land distribution occurred, and nearly all rural freed people stayed poor and propertyless during Reconstruction. They had little choice but to return to work on the plantations, often for former owners. Black men were mostly confined to farm work, unskilled labor, and service jobs. Black women were restricted to domestic work as cooks and maids. Wages were too low to build savings or wealth, although by 1900 a significant number of Southern blacks had acquired small parcels of land. The failure of land reform produced a deep sense of betrayal. Out of the conflict on plantations, new labor systems emerged in the South. The task system survived in the rice areas of South Carolina and Georgia, while supervised wage labor predominated on the sugar plantations of Louisiana. Sharecropping became the norm in the Cotton Belt, and much of the tobacco areas of Virginia and North Carolina. Sharecropping developed first as a compromise between black desires for land and planters' insistence on labor discipline. It allowed each black family to rent a part of a plantation, and the crop was divided between the worker and the owner at the end of the year. Sharecropping gave planters a stable labor force, and former slaves preferred it to gang labor because it freed them from white supervision. But sharecropping became increasingly oppressive over time, especially as declining prices for Southern crops limited opportunities for sharecroppers. The war and its aftermath also greatly impacted white farmers, who experienced what they thought was a loss of freedom. Before the war, most small white farmers had raised food for their families and grew a little bit of cotton. The war and successive crop failure ruined many farmers. To get supplies from merchants, they were forced to grow cotton and commit part of their crop as collateral, property the creditor could seize if a debt was unpaid, which became known as the crop lien. Because interest rates were high and the price of cotton fell steadily, many farmers found themselves in debt. Both black and white farmers found themselves caught in sharecropping and crop lien systems, but a far higher percentage of black farmers rented their land. However, every census from 1880 to 1940 actually counted more white than black sharecroppers. Though the rural South's economy suffered, southern cities saw considerable growth in the post-war period. New railroad lines allowed city merchants to engage in commerce with the North, and a new urban middle class of merchants, railroad entrepreneurs, and bankers benefited from the expansion of cotton production. Reconstruction transformed the lives of all Southerners. The antebellum world of master, slave, and independent yeoman had been replaced by a post-war world with new social classes: landowning employers, black and white sharecroppers, white cotton farmers, black wage workers, and urban businessmen. The debates over land, labor, and political power that defined Reconstruction in America had parallels in other societies that experienced emancipation. In each case, planters tried to make former slaves return to plantation work to grow the same crops as under slavery, and considered freed black workers as lazy and devoid of ambition. Freed black Americans sought independence through owning land to avoid labor similar to that of slavery, or through other strategies to escape white control. Planters attempted to replace freedmen with a new foreign source of labor: Indians in the British case in the Caribbean, and Chinese in the American case. But the United States was unique as a post-slavery society in that it gave freedmen the right to vote, an event that emerged as a result of a struggle between Congress and President Andrew Johnson over the course of Reconstruction. Let's now take a look at the next subtopic, the making of radical Reconstruction. And here's the focus question: what were the sources, goals, and competing visions of Reconstruction? We'll start by looking at presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor to the presidency, was initially responsible for Reconstruction. Johnson rose from poverty to a political career in state politics in Tennessee, which he represented in the U.S. Congress and where he was also governor. Johnson championed Tennessee's small white farmers and made enemies of the state's large slave-owning planters. Staunchly Unionist, Johnson was the only senator from a seceding state to remain in the Senate, and he served as Tennessee's military governor during the war. He was a Southern Democrat, and his vice presidency, being brought in with Lincoln, Republicans hoped would gain support for the party in the South. But Johnson lacked Lincoln's political acumen and ability to compromise. Johnson also defended states' rights. He argued that since secession was illegal, Southern states never actually left the Union or gave up their right to govern their own affairs. And Johnson, while supporting emancipation, was deeply racist and did not believe blacks had a role to play in Reconstruction. So Johnson assumed the White House following President Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. And a month later, in May 1865, Johnson started to release proclamations that inaugurated a period that historians call presidential Reconstruction, essentially lasting from 1865 to 1867, when Congress would take over and roll out radical Reconstruction. Johnson offered pardons, including restoration of political and property rights, except, of course, for slaves, to all white Southerners who took an oath of allegiance, excluding only Confederate leaders and wealthy planters whose pre-war property was worth more than $20,000. But Johnson soon pardoned even those exempted by this rule. He also appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions elected by whites only to establish loyal Southern state governments. These new state governments were required only to abolish slavery, repudiate secession, and refuse to pay Confederate debts. While many people in the North at first supported Johnson's plan, Southern whites mostly returned prominent Confederates and old elites to power, and violence against freed people and Northerners in the South generated opposition to Johnson's policies. New state laws in the South regulating the lives of former slaves, called the Black Codes, caused the most opposition to Johnson's Reconstruction policy. While these laws gave blacks the right to legally marry, own property, and access the courts in some ways, they denied them rights to testify against whites, serve on juries or state militias, or vote. They also allowed authorities to arrest and hire out to white landowners any blacks who refused to sign annual labor contracts, a measure to force the former slaves to return to the plantations. Some states prohibited blacks from buying land and allowed judges to assign black children to work for their former owners without parental consent. These codes, an effort to reinstitute conditions of slavery, violated the free labor principles of the Republican North and caused many in the North to believe that Johnson's policy was actually encouraging white Southerners to restore their pre-war way of life. In December 1865, Johnson declared that the establishment of loyal governments in all Southern states had reunited the nation. But radical Republicans in Congress, who coalesced around opposition to Johnson's policies, called for new state governments that would exclude rebels from power and guarantee the vote to blacks. Remember, the Black Codes that were rolled out in 1865 in some Southern states heavily restricted black rights and black freedom. And many of these loyal state governments that Johnson spoke of had elected former Confederate officials and Confederate officers into office. And that wasn't going to work for the radical Republicans who were abolitionists and advocates for equal rights. The radicals believed that the Union victory presented an opportunity to guarantee equal rights for all, despite race. They welcomed the expanded powers of the federal government and thought federalism and states' rights could not prevent national efforts to secure equal rights. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, and Thaddeus Stevens, representing Pennsylvania in the House of Representatives, were the most prominent radicals. Stevens, in particular, wanted to confiscate the lands of disloyal planters and distribute them to former slaves and northern migrants. But most members of Congress respected property rights too much to embrace Stevens' land reform proposals. Now, although Republicans did have an overwhelming majority in Congress because the South had no representatives, the party was actually divided. Radicals were only a minority. Most Republicans were moderates, and moderates thought Johnson's plan only needed improvement. The moderates also believed that Southern and Northern whites would never accept black suffrage or the black right to vote. Moderates and radicals refused to seat Southerners elected to Congress, but the moderates made sure that Southern governments remained. Moderates extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and proposed a Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which defined all persons born in the United States as citizens and spelled out rights they enjoyed, regardless of race. Equality before the law was central to the bill, making it impossible for states to have laws like the Black Codes that discriminated against blacks. Free labor values also informed the bill, which prohibited laws denying citizens rights to make contracts, bring lawsuits, or enjoy protection of person and property. The bill said nothing, however, of black suffrage. Johnson, who shocked the Congress by vetoing both bills, claimed he was defending states' rights and said blacks did not deserve citizenship. Johnson's vetoes alienated many in the Republican Party, including moderates, and in April 1866, the Civil Rights Bill became the first major law in U.S. history to be passed over a presidential veto. Congress soon created its own Reconstruction plan. It soon passed and sent for ratification the 14th Amendment, which placed in the Constitution the principle of citizenship for all persons born in the United States and empowered the federal government to protect the rights of all Americans. The amendment banned the states from abridging the privileges and immunities of citizens or denying them the equal protection of the law. This language allowed future Congresses and federal courts to give meaning to the promise of legal equality. As a compromise between moderate and radical Republicans, the amendment did not grant black suffrage or the right to vote. But it did stipulate that any state that denied voting rights to any group of men would face a reduction in its representation in Congress. Emancipation also threatened the South's political power, because now all blacks, not just 3/5, would be counted in determining a state's representation in Congress. The 14th Amendment offered the white South's political leadership a choice: allow black men to vote and keep their representation, or limit the vote to whites and lose power in Congress. The 14th Amendment created great conflict between the parties. Not one Democrat voted for it, and only 4 Republicans opposed it. While radicals deplored that it did not give blacks the vote, the amendment made legal equality, regardless of race, a basic right of all American citizens. The 1866 elections revolved around the 14th Amendment. Johnson urged voters to elect men to Congress who supported his policies, and claimed that radicals were plotting to assassinate him. This, along with riots in the southern cities targeting blacks, undermined support for Johnson's allies, and Republican opponents emerged victorious in the elections. But every southern state except Tennessee refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. Johnson and the white South's resistance pushed moderate Republicans into the radical camp, and in March 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which temporarily divided the South into 5 military districts and called for the establishment of new state governments in which black men could vote. This inaugurated the period of radical Reconstruction, which lasted until 1877. Congress simultaneously approved a measure prohibiting the president from removing certain office holders, including members of the cabinet, without the Senate's consent. That was called the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson believed this unconstitutionally limited his authority, and so when he removed Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, who was a radical ally, the House approved articles of impeachment and sent charges against Johnson to the Senate, which was to decide his fate. This was the first time a president had faced trial in the Senate for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. Not all Republicans supported impeachment, and Johnson indicated he would halt his interference with Congress's Reconstruction policy. In doing so, he barely escaped impeachment. Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant for president to run against Horatio Seymour, the Democratic candidate and former New York governor, in the 1868 presidential election. Republicans tarred Democrats with secession and treason, a tactic called waving the bloody shirt, while Democrats denounced Reconstruction as unconstitutional and made racist appeals, arguing that black suffrage violated American political traditions. Grant won the presidential contest, but he won it by a slim margin, about 300,000 votes in the popular vote. Keep in mind, too, that black Americans were allowed to vote in this election, and about 500,000 votes, it's estimated, came from black Americans in favor of Grant. So that 300,000 margin that he had in the popular vote actually came largely from the African American vote. Republicans responded then in February 1869 by adopting the third and final Reconstruction Amendment, the 15th Amendment, which barred federal and state governments from denying the right to vote to any citizen based on their race. Denounced by Democrats, the amendment was ratified in 1870. The problem is, even though the amendment did explicitly prohibit any federal or state governments from denying the right to vote based on race, it left a window open that enabled states to make other suffrage restrictions that weren't based on race, such as literacy tests or property requirements and poll taxes. And it also did not give the vote to women. But nonetheless, it did represent the culmination of abolitionism. Reconstruction laws and amendments reflected the power of the new national state and the idea that citizens should enjoy legal equality. They were, in the words of one Republican, a great constitutional revolution. Foner calls Reconstruction America's second founding. It transformed the federal system and the language of American freedom. Before the Civil War, citizenship had been bounded by race, but Reconstruction laws rejected the notion that citizenship was reserved only for whites. Their guarantees of legal equality affected discriminatory laws in all states, North and South. The new amendments also changed the relationship between states and the federal government. The Bill of Rights had assumed that the central government threatened liberties, but the Reconstruction amendments assumed that only the national government could protect individual rights. They made the Constitution an instrument by which vulnerable minorities could make claims for freedom and against government misconduct at all levels. Many important 20th century Supreme Court decisions were based on the 14th Amendment, such as the 1954 Brown ruling outlawing school segregation, and the 14th Amendment is still in conversation today when it comes to the subject of birthright citizenship for undocumented immigrants who have a child in the United States. Reconstruction also recast the boundaries of American freedom. Exclusions that limited citizenship and its privileges to white men had long defined American democratic practice. Even Republicans committed to universal rights did not want to extend rights to all races. Some Republicans like Anson Burlingame, Frederick Douglass, and Charles Sumner wanted to end discrimination against Asians in the nation's immigration laws and treaties. When in 1870 Sumner tried to strike the word white from naturalization requirements, Western state senators made Africans eligible for naturalization, but barred Asians from becoming naturalized citizens. Up until the 20th century, Asian immigrants could not become citizens, while their white American-born children became citizens automatically. All right, what about the women? Well, women's rights advocates discovered the limits of Reconstruction-era egalitarianism. They saw the expansion of federal power and rights as a moment to advance women's equality. But their demands, especially the demand for women's suffrage or the right to vote, found little support among male politicians, even among radical Republicans who considered Reconstruction an opportunity to benefit black men. The 14th and 15th Amendments specifically benefited men, not women, and caused a division within the feminist camp and between feminists and radical Republicans. Some, like Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, opposed the 15th Amendment because it did not enfranchise women. They didn't see why a black man should be given the right to vote before a white woman. They tried to sever women's rights from abolitionism and even appealed to racism to demand rights for women. Other abolitionist feminists, such as Abby Calley and Lucy Stone, argued that the Reconstruction amendments, while limited, were advances toward universal suffrage and should therefore be supported. These two sides split into two groups, the National Women's Suffrage Association representing the former, and the American Women's Suffrage Association representing the latter. One area where women's political rights did expand during Reconstruction was the Wyoming Territory, which extended suffrage rights to women in 1869 in hopes of attracting women emigrants. Despite drawing the boundaries of freedom at gender, Reconstruction marked the only society in the world in which emancipation had been followed by the extension of citizenship rights to former slaves. Okay, next up, let's take a look at radical Reconstruction in the South. And the focus question for this subtopic is, what were the social and political effects of radical Reconstruction in the South? The Reconstruction Act sparked great political activity among former slaves in the South, who held mass meetings, went on strike, and tried to desegregate public transportation. Thousands of Southern blacks joined the Union League, an organization tied to the Republican Party, and the vast majority of eligible black voters registered to vote. In the words of one former slave turned political leader, blacks had heard the tocsin of freedom. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union and most were under Republican control. Their new state constitutions, drafted in 1868 and 1869 in conventions with substantial black representation, were an improvement over the old state constitutions. They created state-funded systems of free public education, penitentiaries, and orphan and insane asylums where none existed before. They guaranteed equality of civil and political rights and abolished antebellum practices such as whipping as a criminal punishment, property qualifications for office holding, and imprisonment for debt. Though blacks were the majority of Republican voters, white Republicans controlled the state Republican parties and held most political offices. Only South Carolina, with a high percentage of blacks in the population, had a majority black legislature. But the 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift of power in the South. 2 blacks were elected to the U.S. Senate, 14 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 served as the first black governor in Louisiana. Many blacks served in state legislatures, and more blacks than ever before held lower offices such as sheriff, tax assessor, and policeman. Most were former slaves. The South's new state governments also empowered new groups of whites. Some were Northerners who migrated to the South after the war. Opponents called them carpetbaggers, implying they packed their possessions in a suitcase to quickly move to the South and gain the spoils of office. While some were corrupt, most carpetbaggers were Union Army veterans who decided to stay in the South after the war. Others were investors in land and railroads seeking economic opportunity. Yet others were teachers, Freedmen's Bureau officers, or others who traveled to the South to help former slaves. Most white Republicans, however, were from the South and were despised by former Confederates who saw them as treasonous scalawags. While a few were wealthy whites, most were non-slaveholding small white farmers from the Southern upcountry. Many had been Unionists during the war or hoped Reconstruction governments would pass laws favoring indebted farmers. The Reconstruction government's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both black and white children, although usually in segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states also strengthened the economic power of rural blacks by passing laws favoring agricultural workers and sharecroppers. But Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution as many blacks had once hoped, but rather tried by developing railroads which they hoped would spur industrialization, urbanization, and diversified agriculture. Every southern state tried to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies, but a revitalized southern economy failed to take shape. Nevertheless, radical Reconstruction transformed the South by empowering poor whites, northern migrants, and former slaves. It is a measure of how far change had progressed that the reaction against Reconstruction proved so extreme. Next, let's look at the overthrow of Reconstruction, with the focus question for this subtopic being, what were the main factors in both the North and the South for the abandonment of Reconstruction? The South's traditional leadership, which were planters, merchants, and Democratic politicians, condemned the new governments as corrupt and inefficient examples of black supremacy. But corruption, which existed in Reconstruction governments, was confined to no single race, region, or party. The rapid growth of state budgets allowed many to enrich themselves at public expense. But corruption was greatest elsewhere. In the whiskey ring, for example, which involved Grant administration officials, and New York's infamous Tweed ring, controlled by Democrats. Rising taxes needed for schools and railroad development also sparked opposition to Reconstruction, including among poor whites who had initially supported the Republicans but bolted to the Democrats when their economic situation did not improve. Southern whites opposed Reconstruction primarily because they could not accept that blacks should vote, hold political office, or enjoy legal equality. They thought Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planters to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. Violence was endemic in the Reconstruction era South. At first it was local and unorganized, with blacks being assaulted and murdered for refusing to make way for whites on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But the establishment of Republican state governments after 1867 ignited organized campaigns of violence against supporters of radical Reconstruction. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, tried to prevent blacks from voting and tried to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. The KKK, a terrorist organization started in 1866 in Tennessee that soon spread throughout the South, functioned as the military arm of the Democratic Party in that region. In many counties, it started a reign of terror against black and white Republican leaders. But blacks were especially targeted, particularly blacks who held office or exercised political rights. The new Southern governments could not suppress the KKK, and in 1870 and 1871, Congress adopted enforcement acts that outlawed terrorist groups, allowed the president to use the army against them, and defined acts that deprive citizens of civil and political rights as federal crimes. President Grant dispatched federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK, and by 1872, most areas of the South were peaceful. Northern commitment to Reconstruction declined in the 1870s, however. Radicals such as Thaddeus Stevens passed away or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Northerners more and more felt the South should solve its own problems without continuous federal involvement. Many in the North believed that now that the national government had freed the slaves, made them citizens, and given them the vote, blacks had to depend on themselves. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans, angered by corruption in the Grant administration and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. They repeated Democratic criticisms of radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the best men in the South, that region's natural leaders. And I'm putting that in finger quotes. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and actually endorsed Greeley as their candidate as well. But many rank-and-file Democrats could not stomach Greeley. He was a former Whig and Republican who had denounced slavery, and as a result, Grant won a second term to the presidency by a great margin. Nonetheless, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on rolling back Reconstruction. Northern critics stepped up their often openly racist attacks on Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by black rule. A severe depression beginning in 1873 also distracted Northern Republicans from Southern issues. Democrats were widely successful in the 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives. But before this new Congress met, legislators passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which barred racial discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in the states, effectively mitigating the 14th Amendment. 3 years later, the court gutted the enforcement acts by throwing out the convictions of some of those responsible for the Colfax Massacre of 1873, a bloody massacre in which dozens of black Americans were murdered, many of whom were shot execution style after they'd surrendered. By the mid-1870s, then, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats regained control of states with large white voting majorities such as Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, and called themselves redeemers for having redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting besieged governments and Republicans. In 1875 and 1876, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls, capturing states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential election. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrats' Samuel J. Tilden, New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried these states, which both parties claimed to have won, would become president. Congress tried to resolve this impasse by appointing an electoral commission which, with a Republican majority, ultimately decided that Hayes had carried the critical Southern states and been elected. But to secure this result behind the scenes, Republicans negotiated with the Democrats, agreeing to recognize Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats promised to respect black rights and not dispute Hayes' right to office. This became known as the Bargain of 1877, or the Compromise of 1877. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down, which allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state governments there. Reconstruction, defined as America's adjustment to the end of slavery, continued long after 1877. Blacks still voted and in some states held office well into the 1890s. But a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South, blacks held some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all American citizens came to an end in 1877. Only a century later, in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, would the federal government finally act to secure the rights of all, regardless of race. Reconstruction revealed some of the tensions inherent in 19th century discussions of freedom. And with that, we'll conclude this lecture. As always, if you're experiencing any challenges digesting the content or analyzing the primary sources in this week's assignment, please partner up with your peers. If you know any directly, you can partner up with them directly, or you can utilize the coffee shop discussion board in Canvas to ask any questions and get some clarification from your peers. And of course, always feel free to email me as well. I'm here to help you stay on track, and I want to make sure that you're understanding what we're covering week in and week out.